Hello everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Conservation Conversations on Mr. Gill's Science Stuff. I hope you enjoyed the last one. This one could not be more different. We're going from Madagascar to Canada, so we're going from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the wealthiest. We're going from one of the hottest to one of the coldest. We're going from the equator to pretty much near the North Pole. So we couldn't have a more different setting, but I think you'll see some of the conservation lessons are pretty much the same the world over, and hopefully that comes through. The speaker is one of the most enthusiastic, intellectually and academically honest people I've ever had the pleasure to work with. I spent a pretty intense 2 weeks in jungles of Ecuador with him in 2014, which he'll tell you a little bit more about with the spiders and the snakes. And I'd like to say thanks again to Operation Wallacea for the initial introductions and the arranging of the initial expedition where we met. As with the last one, Dan was so full of information, I've had to create a bonus material video to go with this one, which isn't specifically linked to the syllabus, but are interesting things nonetheless. So do check that out for more on indigenous rights, oil in Canada, politics in North America, Trump and Belize and ecotourism, and your invitation to go and visit his new research station in Central America. Enjoy. So hi Dan, thanks very much for agreeing to do this, be a part of it. It's great to see you. So could we start off with just some introductions? Could you introduce yourself and explain where you are in the world, what your role is, and how we met?
Yes, certainly. So first of all, just thank you, Charles, and thanks for allowing me to be part of this. I think it's a fantastic initiative you guys are doing here, and any chance I have to speak to students, especially about conservation and the importance of nature, I welcome it. So just thanks again.
No, great. It's
Uh,
great
so
to have you.
my name is Dan Hammerschlag. I currently work for the City of Toronto as a ravine planner, which essentially means I help manage the urban forest within the ravine systems within Toronto. We first met in 2014 on an expedition to Ecuador. I was the country manager in charge of overseeing the field operations, and it was our first season in Ecuador. So you guys were the guinea pigs
Yeah.
of the expedition, and we ended up spending a week in the high elevation rainforest, cloud forest, as well as the lowland Amazonian rainforest. And I think we immediately hit it off over our shared love of adventure and nature. And so, yeah, that was a
Yeah, it was
great
a great
experience.
time.
Initially, I was born in South Africa. So from there, I always had an interest in wildlife. I did my undergrad in biology, and one of my final courses in undergrad was a field course to Costa Rica, and we were looking at sustainable coffee production and how that related to biodiversity. So that really sparked my interest. And then I did my master's in environmental sciences, and I particularly focused on wildlife management and
Hmm.
community-based conservation.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to spend 5 months in Costa Rica conducting my research, and I studied the link between poaching and wildlife conservation because that was a really important area of concern in that region.
Yeah.
Uh, Lucky enough, I was really fortunate through my master's to have good funding and have many opportunities. One of them was to take part in an expedition to Indonesia, and that's how I first became involved with Operation Wallacea. And through there, I had an opportunity to assist with a lot of different types of research, field research. And this was really my first experience into conducting field research and biodiversity research, and really being out there and doing firsthand work in the field. I was put in touch with a primatologist, contemporary of Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall. Her name was Anne Russin,
Yeah.
and she was monitoring orangutans in Indonesian Borneo. So I was able to spend a month with her, getting more experience doing orangutan nest surveys. Then following my master's, I went back to Operation Wallacea, was able to help run many of the expeditions there to Indonesia, Peru, Ecuador. And then I finally settled in Toronto, back in the city, and I got a job working with one of the conservation authorities, helping with restoration and wildlife. Um, and now I currently work for the city. And essentially, I help manage the urban forest, and determine what trees can be removed,
Great. I mean, so we haven't heard from anyone in sort of in North America yet, and so obviously Canada is, really important in terms of its biodiversity, but not in the same way that some of the places you've mentioned are, like Costa Rica and Indonesia. It's non-tropical. So can you explain to everyone why, particularly, that Canada's biodiversity, particularly its forestry, are really, really important and really special?
Yeah, certainly. So Canada is one of the most unique places in terms of its forest system. The only place on Earth, or the only place on Earth that have more forest cover or an intact forest, are Russia and Brazil.
Right.
So Canada has the third largest intact forest system in the world. In over half of our country is covered in forest. So it really is a large part of the Canadian identity. We have some of the most, one of the largest undisturbed tracts of forest in the world at about 3 million square kilometers of just completely undisturbed, pristine habitat. One of the most impressive forests within Canada is the boreal forest.
Yeah.
And this, this forest, it stretches from northern Canada to just like below the Arctic, south to really where the cities start and the urban environments start.
Yeah.
It is this forest system is just beautiful. It's dominated by spruce and wetlands, lakes. It's got 1.5 million lakes, so it's got more lakes than any ecosystem, comparable ecosystem in the world. So you can imagine how important it is for wildlife as well.
Yeah.
And because of the importance for wildlife and because it's such a large undisturbed area, you find animals such as, from all different groups of species, such as you have the largest land mammal in North America, the wood bison, all the way to the smallest and the pygmy shrew, as well as all of the iconic wildlife that you would think for Canada, moose, cougars, bears, lynx, mountain lions. So it really is an important part, especially for Canada's wildlife.
Yeah.
They also have, it's actually, Canada is one of the really important breeding grounds for migratory birds. And we have, just in the boreal forest alone, there's about 450 species of birds can be found there. And that's not even including migratory birds, songbirds, things that are stopping over or overwintering here. You can imagine with such a large forest, it also helps with climate change and mitigating some of the ecological effects from greenhouse gases and global warming. I'm sure you guys know that trees store carbon, they sequester carbon, and Canada's forests store about 6 tons of carbon dioxide per square kilometer a year. So it really plays a large role in acting as a vacuum, a sink for carbon. Our forests play not only a huge role in wildlife, in carbon sequestration, but our daily lives as Canadians revolve heavily around the forest. We go camping, we go hiking. Our provincial and national parks, they have hiking trails, skating trails, skiing trails, but they're all protected and they're all managed and maintained so that human disturbance and impact is minimal and negligent. So the forests are really important, and that's not even mentioning how they play into the economy. I mean, forest and timber products contribute about $30 billion to Canada's economy annually. Wow. So you can see how important they are. And one of the most impressive, I think, ecosystems anywhere in the world is found on the west coast of Canada. It's called the Great Bear Rainforest. It's the largest temperate rainforest in the world. Stretches all the way from Alaska down into the northern United States, really. So it's 250 miles of continuous temperate rainforest, and it's actually the most biodiverse spot on Earth per square inch, and it's known as the Amazon of the North. So I've never been there. I would absolutely love to be there. One of the most impressive and most fascinating things for me in terms of wildlife are the coastal wolves and the commode bear, the spirit bear. So coastal wolves, they are a subspecies of wolves that they've because they've been so isolated from other populations and they're localized to the coast, they have formed into and developed into their own unique subspecies that are really adapted to living on the coast. They can swim for miles. They feed on fish. And then commode bears or spirit bears, they are only found in this area of the world, and they are essentially black bears, but they are a recessive gene. So one in 10 of these have a recessive gene, and they're just a magnificent golden white bear, and they also hold significance in indigenous cultures. But that is somewhere that is
right?
my list to go.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, that you've painted a vivid picture there of the kind of ecosystem that Canada has, this vast and diverse forest. You also alluded to something that leads on to the next question, which is the fact that you said you go from the north to habitation, to where the cities are. So, I mean, my students might not know that most of the habitation in Canada is kind of along the southern border, and that isolation can also lead to opportunities for exploitation. And what they've got to know about is they've got to know about conflicts between, uses for the land in terms of conservation versus human use. And in Canada, as I understand, it's quite heavily oil exploited, particularly around places like Calgary and various other things. So in terms of that, where have you seen in Canada sort of, either conflicts or conservation working well with exploitation of the land and that kind of oil, and particularly pipelines, I understand, are quite a big issue?
Yeah, certainly. That without a doubt, the biggest source of conflict in Canada is over pipelines and the oil sands.
Mm.
There are proponents on both sides of the issue and of the conflict, but hands down, this is the most hot topic issue in the environmental field, but as well as just in the general life. For those of you who don't know, oil sands are loose sands that are naturally occurring mix of sand, clay, and water, which is soaked in this really, really heavy, thick, viscous form of oil known as bitumen. The largest ones are found in Alberta, in what's known as the Alberta tar sands or the oil sands.
Yep.
And the oil sands, they're actually larger than all of England. So you can imagine, you can imagine how intense and how much resource extraction, how resource intensive it is for this particular environment. And that kind of gives you an idea also of the importance in terms of the economy and the use of this oil and why there is such a conflict. I mean, if only 30% of the oil was extracted from the tar sands, it would be able to supply North America with enough oil for the next 100 years.
Wow.
So
that's a hell of a stat.
Even aside from the pipelines, it's so intensive to be able to extract it. You need all this water. So it takes about 700 liters of water to produce 1 barrel of oil from the tar sands.
Wow, okay.
So not only is it using so much water, it also emits and contributes to the greenhouse gases so significantly, so much more than traditional crude oil. So 30% more greenhouses are produced from this production than conventional oil.
Yeah.
It actually contributes 40 million tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere a year. I mean, just from this one particular industry within one province of Canada.
That's pretty staggering. Even with the forests, I guess you're not taking that out of the atmosphere every year. So
exactly. So even though we do have such a large forest system, we need it, and you can imagine how much worse things would be if we didn't have that.
Mm. So there's a very clear picture of the source of conflict. But what about the anywhere that it's worked well? Is there anywhere you can think of that these things managed to be able to sit side by side?
Yeah, so I think with the oil industry, that is a really difficult one. I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but all these projects are required to undergo environmental assessments, environmental impact studies before even getting approval.
Yeah.
One of these, and within this, involves going and looking for and taking biologists going to study the species, identify any significant plant or animal species, and then identifying areas where you can't undertake development, or they'll identify areas that need to be restored or that need to be protected. So certain industries might have to purchase other pieces of land for the sole purpose of
Yeah,
protecting it.
kind of an offsetting type
That,
arrangement.
exactly. So that's one kind of area. But one of the best examples I've seen of this is actually in Toronto, where I live, and there it's called the Don Valley Brickworks. There was this
Okay.
massive brick quarry built in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, and it was really to source clay to build bricks to build the city.
Yeah.
Uh, it was in the middle. Traditionally at the time was a valley, forest feature, rivers. There were streams, wetlands, marshes all over, and they completely dug it up for brick making. When it was ending its production, nearing the end of its lifetime, in about the 1990s, the owner at the time donated that or sold it back to the city of Toronto, to the local government, for a fraction of the price, but with the condition that it is protected and restored and used for conservation purposes.
Brilliant.
So since then, there's been a lot of work gone into that. Now you have ponds on there, you have little stands of aspen and small stands of forest, you have meadows, and you're seeing the benefits of it. You see the wildlife, you see deer, you see foxes, you see coyotes, and that's just one of the best. And there's also trail systems, so people can come in and enjoy that as well. So
Use it for
I think
recreation
that's
purposes. Yeah.
exactly one of the best examples that I've seen, at least firsthand and really local to where I live.
Yeah, so we have a very similar set of systems in the UK where after a quarry or a piece of industry has run its natural course, then it gets handed back over for conservation and used to manufacture something natural, which is, yeah, it's a lovely way to do things. One of the other syllabus points we have to talk about is the impact of artificial human extracted chemical inputs onto the land. So what does the sort of effect of the oil industry or other industries look like on the land when it goes wrong? What happens there?
Another big impact we've seen is in the farming industry. I mean, uh, we have a lot of Canada has a really big agricultural system and
Yep.
agricultural sector, and with that, you obviously have a need to protect and ensure that your crops are sustaining and are growing and are healthy, and that farmers can make a living. So one of the biggest examples, and I'm sure you're all aware, is the neonics, the destructive chemicals and compounds that are really harmful for bees.
Yep.
They're used on, traditionally in Canada, they're used on corn, for corn crops, but they have devastating effects on bee
Yeah.
populations, and they can just cause colony collapses and hives just be completely destroyed. And so that's one of the big ones.
Yeah,
And
they're referred to in the UK as, I think, neonicotinoids is what people would know them as in the newspapers. There's been a lot of talk about them, neonicotinoids.
despite all of this, and despite knowing about this, like Canada's known about this, the government has known about this, has evidence of this since 2012, but we continue to use them. They haven't even been banned yet.
I guess the next point then, to link it to another part of the syllabus, we try and teach the students about environmental surveying techniques. And you mentioned taking groups of biologists out into sites, into fields, to sort of gather data. Now, our data gathering, because we're just teaching it, is a little bit boring. It's usually going out into the school field with the transect and counting daisies, which isn't the most inspiring of use, but it's the techniques we're trying to teach them, the random sampling, transect use, mark release recapture, all these sampling methods. So I wonder if you can liven that up a bit and talk about some of the places you've seen data being gathered and how that works in the places you've been, and where the results go. What's the data actually used for? Because really nobody cares how many daisies there are in our school field, but some of the stuff you've done, they're really going to care about. So I wonder if you have some examples for that.
I wouldn't say that nobody cares. I'm sure there are people that love daisies and would be fascinated by that.
Yeah.
But I'm with you. I like to be more in the field, in the tropics, elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that the techniques are necessarily any different.
No.
When I was doing my master's, for example, I conducted wildlife surveys and poaching surveys. So I essentially did the same thing. I had plots and just walked 100-meter transects back and forth, looking for any evidence of wildlife. So any food, any tracks, any nests, as well as any evidence of poaching, such as evidence of traps or traps on site still. Oftentimes you would see trees that were cut, that had a clean cut from a machete. So you knew that that was some evidence of poaching. So with that type of research, I used it and I created two maps and I overlaid them on top of each other to try to find a correlation between hunting, between poaching, and where the significant wildlife was being found. So that was then utilized to as a tool for conservation, and we tried to develop community-based patrols within those areas that were being particularly targeted or particularly hardest hit. So that's just one example. When I was in Indonesia and Peru and Ecuador, as you alluded to, there was a number of surveys that took place, anything from vegetation surveys, studying the amount of canopy there was, to wildlife surveys, to mist netting for birds and bats, to camera trapping for mammals, to mark recapture with civets in Indonesia, to pitfall traps where we would dig buckets, dig holes and put buckets and line like a tarp or a barrier so that you would have snakes or amphibians, other reptiles would hit the tarp, fall into the bucket. You'd be able to go and weigh them, take measurements, sex them, figure out what species it was. We did light trapping, so we would set up a giant sheet with a light behind it, which would attract a lot of insects. And a lot of these were really used to study, to collect baseline population data. Once you have that, that really acts as the foundation for ongoing research. You know what there is, and now you know how you can see how different factors and external factors affect these populations and affects the wildlife. So you can now have this information, and you can try to see what the effect of increased precipitation is, or heavier drought, or things like that. And that is really important, because then that can be utilized to leverage funding to put back into the projects and protect more land, conduct more research, etc. I've also done surveys with orangutans, as I mentioned before, where these were more observational surveys, because just like there are hard techniques, there's also more soft survey techniques, such as interviewing or observational studies. So with the orangutans, we were looking at their movement and their behavior, trying to figure out what routes they would take and what drew them to those routes, to those certain paths. And again, that was being used to bring in more funding, to carry out more research, to increase the protected area, purchase more land, donate it back to the government and the protected areas. So those are a few examples that I've had outside of my city. But now currently within Toronto, we employ kind of similar techniques, but in a much different way. So in Toronto, the biggest metric that we look for, and the biggest characteristic that our forestry department looks at, is canopy cover. So if you were to imagine looking down from an aerial view and seeing just the tops of the trees, that's what we look for. And that's how we measure the state of the urban forest. And we try to, our metric right now for measurement is trying to get 40% of the city covered in forest canopy.
40% and to do of the city? That's an ambitious target.
So right now we're at about 28%.
Right.
This whole 40% came from a study done in the US several years ago. Since then, they found that isn't really realistic. That would be more for rural environments, rural areas where there isn't a high population, isn't a lot of development. And they found that in cities, really the ideal and the max would be around 30%. So we're really close to that target. But that just speaks to, again, the importance of forests in Canada, and especially the importance of urban forests within cities. And we're constantly doing doing surveys, collecting the health on the trees, so we can again look at trends and try to establish long-term goals for monitoring and maintenance. And we take the health, we look at tolerance to, say, salt because they're planted next to the road. We look at any insect infestations or
Yep.
potential pests or diseases that are emerging. And we utilize that to then develop a forest management plan that will be used in the future to protect and maintain the forest.
That's a lot of really good examples of what our techniques are for. Put it in context, that we're not just doing these transects and random samplings for no reason. They do actually contribute to real data. So, I mean, the next one is obviously you've done a lot of these studies in a lot of parts of the world. In your experience overall, you're looking at sort of poaching and damaged habitats and all that kind of stuff. Why do you think it is that people actually damage their environments, be it Canada or Costa Rica or Ecuador? What is there anything sort of common you can draw? Because I'm sure people don't maliciously want to damage their environments. So what is it that drives them to harm their own world?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that is a problem, and I personally think one of the reasons, and the main reason is we've lost our connection with nature.
Right.
We don't see it as something that's intrinsically linked to us anymore, but rather something that is external and outside. And humans generally have an anthropocentric view by nature, so they believe that everything centers around us. So we tend to try to claim ownership over anything we can.
Yeah.
And I think that this leads to the mindset that nature is at our disposal and it's a resource for us to use to do whatever we see fit with, when this isn't really the case. And I think really this challenges our fundamental beliefs and knowledge that we know we need nature. We know that nature is vital to our survival,
Mm-hmm.
but it's often easier to just disassociate than address these issues, which would involve changing your own behavior and your own lifestyle.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's clear cutting forests or hunting or poaching or buying plastic water bottles or using plastic grocery bags or factory farming, I think it's easier to look away and turn a blind sight to these decisions that are difficult decisions, and they do take you outside of your comfort zone. They do will affect your lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
and it might not be easy for people. So I think oftentimes it's easier to kind of put that in the back of your mind rather than really challenge yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this, but especially in Aboriginal and Indigenous cultures in Canada, they have the 7-generation rule. So they always look 7 generations ahead. So they determine what they're doing and their actions based on how it'll affect their kids and their grandkids and their great grandkids and so on and so forth for 7 generations down the line. Well, one of the big things I think is community involvement.
Yeah. Well, this leads exactly to the next question, which is what's probably the most successful forms of conservation that you've seen. I mean, how do you fight exactly what you've said? And I think we're going to get a people-centered answer, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think from my experience and my background, community-based conservation is the most successful form of conservation. Instead of going out or going in as outsiders to a different environment and saying, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to protect it, and ignoring the needs of the local communities, that's not going to work. So rather than going in and telling them what to do, I think it's important to go in first and listen to what their needs are, because people aren't just going and destroying their environment because it's fun and they want to. Especially in the Americas, a lot of communities are poor communities, and they're really rural, and they don't traditionally have access to the same things we do. They don't have a grocery store where they can go pick up food. They don't have a hardware store where they can go pick up lumber. So addressing these needs, I think, is vital to conservation. I think by working with communities to acknowledge their needs and and then use this as a tool to address them. I think that's the strongest form that conservation can take.
Yeah. Can you think of any examples of such community-led conservation initiatives that you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the best that I've seen is, at least firsthand in my experience, was in Costa Rica. There was a sustainable, we looked at sustainable coffee and sustainable agriculture because traditionally, coffee agriculture is slash and burn. You clear cut an area and you plant it with nothing but coffee, which is
Yeah.
obviously very destructive. So we were looking at how can we utilize farming and coffee as a tool for conservation. So we went in, and the model was to essentially a cooperative model where you get a number of organizations or community groups that agree to the same vision and the same ethos, and then they work together to achieve that. So in this example and project, we were looking at how can we prevent the clear cutting of these forests. So we worked with communities, with local groups, to come up with a plan to selectively manage those areas, selectively harvest it. So only take out certain trees while leaving some of the other significant trees and species that contribute to the
Yeah.
canopy or for wildlife. And then this way, you still have a healthy forest. You still are able to grow coffee. And we were found that this is actually one of the better forms of coffee and the better types of coffee because it actually produces more flavor and more aroma. So that was one example. And then and the reason this worked is because we were invested in the local communities. So we said, okay, if you're gonna take part in this and you're willing to change up your agricultural practices, we will guarantee you a fair price, a fair trade price for your coffee beans.
Yeah.
And that meant no matter what happened, if one year they had a devastating season or they were impacted by crops or drought, they would still get the same price for their coffee as they would any other year. And this then allowed them to have access to dentists, to doctors, to education, and or better education systems, all because of this one model of working with the community to, again, identify their needs
Yeah.
and use that as a tool to conservation.
Yeah, I mean, there's fantastic examples, and quite similar in a lot of ways to what I've been hearing from other parts of the world. So obviously, that if we can do that, and I'm thinking of your example there with forests, if you can talk about selective felling and things like that. Have you ever seen an example, well, maybe in Canada, maybe elsewhere in the Americas, where forest has successfully come back? I mean, one of the things our students have to talk about is succession, the idea of either primary or damaged environments building back up to climax communities that are as they were. I mean, I'm trying to think of how your oil fields after they've been exploited might recover, your clay pit, how long that would take to recover, all the forests in Costa Rica. So how long does this sort of thing take, do you think?
Uh, it definitely doesn't happen overnight.
Mm.
It takes years and years and years of working, but also just setting it aside and just leaving it. One really interesting example I've seen is in Costa Rica again, where there was large pieces of land that had been clear cut, and there was this one couple. I think they were actually American, and they had an idea: what happens if we take uh, orange peels, because oranges were also grown in Costa Rica and are also grown in Costa Rica. But they said, what happens if we take all of the scrap orange peels and just dump them, just put them in a field and just let's see what happens. Out of nowhere, you saw this amazing piece of forest again,
Wow.
and it completely regenerated. And it was just it's one of I encourage you,
I've never heard of
if
that
you have the
before.
opportunity, yeah,
Yeah.
to look it up. I'm sure you just can Google Costa Rica and orange
Orange peel
fields
forest
experiment,
recovery. Yeah.
and it's quite remarkable. It really is.
Wow. There's a form of restoration ecology that I know we're both quite keen on the idea of. It's maybe more practical in Canada than it is in the UK, which is rewilding with large carnivores. So you want to? I know that this has been tried in North America quite extensively, and there are small pilots in the UK. But you want to tell us about some of the successes that rewilding's had in North America?
Yeah, definitely. This is a topic that really interests me. I love large carnivores. I love large mammals.
Mm.
So I found this particular example and this particular project absolutely fascinating. And uh, this is the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park
Yep.
within North America. So Yellowstone National Park sits on the borders of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And in the 1800s, when people began to settle the land and start farming and set up agricultural towns, wolves naturally started to prey on the domestic livestock because as the forests were cleared for to make way for farms, naturally the wolves lost some of their prey and lost some of their
Hmm.
habitat and started coming into contact with settlers, and that really brought about a war against the wolf. And the wolves were then just hunted to really extinction. The national park was established in 1872, but there was no regulations on hunting, so people just continued to hunt and continued to drive down populations until eventually in 1926 the wolves were completely eradicated
Yeah.
from the national park. And this immediately had impacts, which was actually fascinating. So when the wolves were gone, this just created a cascade of ecosystem changes where the wolves were gone. So now you have their main prey, which were elk. Those populations just boomed and they began to skyrocket.
Yeah.
Now, with larger populations, they were just grazing at an unsustainable level. They really destroyed a lot of the forest cover there. They grazed on a lot of deciduous plants, woody species,
Mm.
shrubs. So that really changed the ecosystem. You lost a lot of the forests, and because a lot of this uh, was on rivers and stream banks and near those type of environments, this affected the water courses because you have fewer trees, you have more erosion
Yeah.
concerns, and this actually started causing the rivers to actually change course because they started to erode, they started to then that would affect the flow, and you actually saw the rivers move, the entire river system move. This then affected other species as well. So beavers, because they didn't have uh, as much food source in willow species because those were being grazed upon, they went extinct from the park. They were extirpated from the park as
Yeah.
well. You then saw uh, the red foxes, their population started to decrease as well because with wolves gone, uh, coyotes started to take over, but they weren't able to control the elk population, but they were able to outcompete with the red foxes. So you started to see a big decline in the foxes. Um, and with all of these changes and with everything happening, people eventually, kind of towards the 90s, the 80s and 90s, people started to understand and really think, what, maybe this isn't the best thing. Maybe we shouldn't have taken wolves out of this area because look at all the
Look at what's
devastating
happened.
impacts
Yeah.
that have happened. So then in 1995, uh, conservationists from Canada and the States, they partnered together to come up with this program for the reintroduction of the wolves. So into Yellowstone. So they took initially they took a small group of wolves, small population from Canada, and moved them down and relocated them into Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah.
And instantly you saw a change in the ecosystem. You saw things begin to rewild, begin to restore themselves to what they should be and to the natural balance of things. So, and this was uh, after 70 years. The wolves were gone for 70 years. So you can imagine how much change had taken place over that time. And when they were eventually reintroduced into the park, you saw that the elk population started to decline.
Mm.
And with the elk numbers declining, you had grazing levels were lower and they decreased. So you had new vegetation growing and you had new aspen stands and willow species. They
Yeah.
started to grow. Now that you had willows, you had a food source for beavers. So beavers started to come back into the park. And with beavers, you now have them also creating dams and they're helping to alter the water course as well. And now that you have new trees going and new strands of forest, those help with erosion and those are help with the stream system. And you actually saw the streams and the river system revert back to its natural course. So you can literally see, if you were to look at an aerial view, you can see the difference between the river system before and after. It really is something amazing that you wouldn't even think that all of
Yeah.
these can happen just from removing one apex predator.
It's a
Uh,
fantastic example. I mean, it's
yeah,
literally a textbook example of why you need why you need those apex predators. Wolves moving rivers. It's a
exactly.
fantastic example. And then
Yeah,
we have the same issues in the UK. I mean, there's experiments with rewilding, bringing lynx back into East Anglia, and with the suggestions of wolves into parts of Scotland, because we are at the stage now where we're struggling with the small deer called muntjac. I mean, how do you? I guess the next one is, how do you convince people that this kind of thing is important? I mean, in terms of balancing, because people have to farm, they have to eat, they have to live somewhere, and there's a lot of us around now. So how do you, in a North American context, sort of, balance the needs of people with the needs of conservation for people who aren't necessarily specialists?
yeah, and that's a very valid question. I think it's very similar to what we're seeing happen all over the world. I think one of the biggest things we need to do uh, is build our economy around the environment.
Hmm.
That's been one of the biggest sources of conflict. Is how can the economy needs to take precedent over the environment. That's why you see the oil industry. That's why you see mining. That's why you see all of this. Uh, However, if we shift our focus and shift our mindset to the environment and the economy can be one, I think that is the biggest thing we need to do. And I think there should be ways to try to convince industries that have traditionally been resistant to change. I think we need to convince them that change is okay, and it doesn't mean the end of the economy. It doesn't mean the end of their business, and it doesn't mean the end of their way of life.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think that's absolutely the way we should go. So if I can take you to a completely different country, this was news to me when I first reached out to you to have a go to be involved in this. But your latest project is in a completely different country. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your field center, that your field station that you're trying to set up in Belize? I mean, that sounds like a fantastic project.
Yeah, I mean,
So
this is something I'm very excited about. We uh, met people and we knew people who a couple also Canadians. They went and purchased 200 acres of forest in Belize, and their whole idea was to protect that and essentially have their little slice of paradise where they
mm,
can do all the research they want and just explore their own interests. They, for the past 8 years, spent building it up, putting in the infrastructure, managing it, forming relationships, and they've really got to the point where they kind of hit their limit, and they would like they need help to grow it. So
yeah.
Belize is one of the most important actually areas in the Americas for biodiversity, not only in the forest, but it also has outside of Australia the biggest coral reef system in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, the
That's incredible.
Mesoamerican reef. It,
Yeah.
it, it stretches. It's the same one that's connected to Mexico, goes
Mm.
down the Americas, all throughout there. Um, so it's just a country that really drew us to it and really drew our interest. And so right now we are working to set up an NGO, a non-governmental organization, so that we can start to apply for funding and start bringing in researchers, PhD students, master students, high school groups to really get hands-on experience working in the field, working in the forest, working with scientists, working with local communities. That's one of the big things. It kind of ties all of this back in with our passion with community-based conservation, wildlife management, and the environment. The whole goal would be to be able to continually bring in funding to continue to do research in this area. Belize is actually has one of the highest population of jaguars in the entire world,
Wow.
so that really strikes an interest and strikes a fancy with
Yeah,
me.
yeah. No, definitely for me. I mean, one of my strongest memories of Ecuador is you and I finding the first picture of the jaguar in that area of the interior of Ecuador. and actually finding that off the camera trap. And you and I were the first people to see a jaguar, if only a picture, in that area, and that was a brilliant conservation moment. So if you can,
Me too. It was like a eureka moment
yeah,
almost. I mean, it was, yeah, it was fantastic.
yeah,
So, and that's exactly what we're trying to do in Belize, and there's always a spot for you guys
yeah. What do
anytime you want.
you think, guys? We'll go down. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have plenty of interest in going off to Belize. Absolutely. Yeah, so that sounds like a fantastic project, and I wish you all the best with it. I mean, you're doing, I think, more for the environment than most people could say in a lifetime that they're doing, and more for conservation than most. But if you had, a little bit more power, like we all would like, if you were in government or had some kind of snap your fingers power, and you could change something about either people's approach to conservation or something physical in the world, what do you think it would be?
Um, I'd remove Donald Trump. No.
Good answer.
So I think we need a complete overhaul of the education system, so that and our social construct, so that we stop teaching some of these outdated subjects and start focusing curricula around the environment, around how the environment can really tackle a lot of these systemic issues. We need to start talking about the green economy. We need to start talking about indigenous rights. We need to start talking about equity and equality. I mean, you see some of the most important environments in the world: Amazon rainforest, northern Canada. The populations, they're the ones that probably are the hardest hit by climate change, by all of this, and we need to we need to be equitable with how we distribute these resources. And I really think if we can overhaul our education system and start shifting that focus,
Yeah.
I think this can really lead to reshaping our society and to one that is more environmentally centered and friendly. I think we also need to start valuing our wildlife and our wild areas and building laws that are aimed at protecting these assets, holding people accountable who misuse and expropriate these resources.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. So, I mean, it brings us to our last point. I mean, obviously, the target audience for this and who you're talking to is a bunch of very able, A-level students generally. Certainly within my school, maybe there'll be other people who watch this as well. Who hopefully some of them will go off out into the world and do something with biology or with policy or with conservation, geography, some sort of thing like that. Is there? Hopefully you will, won't you? Is there anything you'd like to sort of give them as a message to take away as they go off into their further studies and into their careers?
Yeah, so I would say find your passion and do everything in your power to make that a reality.
Mm.
Don't let anyone tell you that what you're doing isn't important, and don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something. Uh, I mean, look at me. My dream from a young age was to study wildlife, was to be the next David Attenborough, or Jane Goodall. And nobody was really in school when you're younger. Nobody encourages that. Nobody believes that's even possible. Um, but I never stopped. I haven't stopped, and I won't ever stop, because
Yeah.
it's something that I love. It's something that inspires me. It's something that makes me want to get up every morning and do what I can, and do my job to protect the environment. So that's what I would say. If you're passionate about something, stick to it.
That's a very wise message. So thank you so much for getting involved with this. That's been absolutely brilliant. I'm sure the students will really appreciate your insights, and best of luck with Belize.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome.
It's been my absolute pleasure. I'm so glad that I got an opportunity to speak to you and everyone, and just good luck, everything going forward, and don't forget to just follow your passions and follow your heart, and help us make the world a better place.
A good message to end on. What a great message. So I hope you can agree there's absolutely tons in that can be applied. Um, Same as in the Madagascar video, you've got an awful lot to work with. There are tons of examples and tons of really rich and useful information from a North American context. So I hope you enjoyed that. Do check out the bonus material video for more on the politics stuff, Trump, oil, the research station in Belize, and so on and so forth. And next up, we're coming a little closer to home, and we're going to look at conservation from an agriculturalist point of view, and we're going to look at parts of Romania, Transylvania, and the situation with agriculture and conservation right here in the UK. So I'll see you then.